Good morning, hello, and welcome to the TCI What We Need Spotlight interview series. We would really like to thank you for being available for this session and for giving us your time. I would now request you to please tell us your name, where do you live, and what do you do?
Okay, thank you. I'm Dorothy Gould, and I live in London in the UK. I very much see myself as a survivor of mental health services and also institutionalisation. And just to say, my main work nowadays is coordinating a group called Liberation. It's a user-led, community-based group for people with experience of mental distress and trauma. And its aim is to promote the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thank you for that introduction. So as you already know, that the UN guidelines on deinstitutionalization have been recently officially adopted, and deinstitutionalization is a topic our movement of persons with psychosocial disabilities have been working on for decades. So could you please tell us what all you and your organization Liberation have been doing in your works and advocacy to promote deinstitutionalization in your country?
Yeah, thank you for that. And just for the audience to explain, in the UK, we tend to use mental distress or trauma and unusual experiences. So when I use those words, that's what we're using for psychosocial disability. So just to make sure everyone's following that okay. So if I just say a little bit more about Liberation, because that's relevant to deinstitutionalisation in England. I set it up because of the need for a group led by people in mental distress, which takes a lead in championing the UN Convention in England, just because it's so important we have rights under this convention and that those rights are both recognised and implemented. And at the moment, that just hasn't been happening. And deinstitutionalisation obviously is very much part of that because it's absolutely fundamental to the convention. And at Liberation, we've been working really hard to promote it. So to tell you some of the things that we've been doing, a very first step has been to make the convention better known. And just to explain a bit more about that, government ministers themselves can lack awareness of it or not really understand it, even though the UK government has actually signed up to the treaty. The same is true of many service commissioners and service providers. So it's a bit shocking, really. Our media in England also draws heavily on a medical model as opposed to a human rights model. And also in terms of the general public, including many people using mental health services, often they don't know about the convention at all. And that's really worrying. And that's why the first step has been to try and make the convention better known and better understood. And it is actually a really uphill task to try and achieve full human rights, because this country really is still at a very basic level. I know that the UK government likes to market itself as a world leader in terms of human rights, but I have to say that really isn't the reality. This country's history of colonisation is still a stain on those in power to this day. And the government continues to contravene many basic human rights, particularly those set out in the UN Convention. Another key issue for us in the UK is the fact that UK law is based on the European Convention on Human Rights, not on the UN Convention on Rights of Disabled People. And the European Convention obviously is important, but a big problem is that people in this country think that convention is enough. It's not. And so Liberation is challenging that. And just to give one example, the European Convention still allows us to be detained in psychiatric hospitals against our will and forcibly treated. And current government plans, so far from moving forward to the Convention on Rights of Disabled People, they're actually planning to reassess even the rights we have under our Human Rights Act. And that's the act which is based on the European Convention. So that's a big issue, trying to explain that when we're talking about rights, we're talking about far more fundamental rights still than the European Convention. A key aspect of what we're doing at the moment at Liberation is changing current mental health law in England and the planned, in quotes, reform of it. And that's because planned reforms still fall well short of giving full human rights to those of us in mental distress or those of us with unusual experiences. The fact that the reform does fall so short, it's just heartbreaking, because it's a really missed opportunity to give us rights, our full rights, after being treated for years as second-class citizens. And to try and counter it, some of what we're doing is using submissions to the government, presentations at conferences, representing to key groups. Unfortunately, most professional groups essentially support mental health law as it is. Joint work with other user-led groups and sympathetic allies, approaches to the media and other channels like this to promote a radically different approach to the reform of mental health law. And these are some of our messages. We're challenging the medicalisation of mental distress and unusual experiences. It's said that rates of mental illness in the UK have been increasing rapidly, but the reality is that people are actually experiencing very natural human reactions to trauma. During the COVID pandemic, it's not that more and more people have mysteriously been developing brain disorders. Increased trauma during the pandemic has been a very natural human reaction to the pandemic, and also some poor handling of it by the UK government. It shouldn't be medicalised. And also the ever increasing growth in socio-economic injustice in the UK, it's appalling. And again, it's causing huge trauma. Our increasingly right-wing government needs to focus on resolving this, instead of promoting the idea that many of us will really just lack resilience, so that our trauma is an individual problem. We're also challenging the fact that current law and planned reform are still based on a paternalistic model, the assumption that we need protection and that this can therefore justify overruling our human rights. We're challenging false assumptions about risk, the idea that we can be detained because of risks to ourselves or others. There is, in fact, there just isn't adequate research evidence in any case that detention even has any impact on risk. But that fact is somehow it just gets bypassed. Also bypassed is the fact that we're far more at risk from other people than we are at any risk to other people. And in the UK, the reality is that horrifying examples of abuse in psychiatric hospitals and of hate crime against us within society as a whole have been emerging more and more clearly. And we need reparation because of this. We're challenging the fact that current mental health law and planned reform are still based on a mental capacity model, instead of recognising our legal capacity in line with Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. It's just so very wrong that current law and planned reform of it are still using mental capacity to justify detaining us against our will and forcibly treating us. we're calling on the UK government not to use community services just to replicate a medical model. The reason we're also including that in our messages is because in the community as well, medical model services are dominant and still receive most funding. It's also because the government doesn't seem to have any real concept of rights-based community services which enable us to live independently in the community, just like anyone else. We're also continuing to call on the government to address intersectional issues in all aspects of its approach to mental health reform. And that's because the draft mental health bill falls well short of addressing particular issues for people in mental distress from racialised communities. The inhumane approach which the government is taking to asylum seekers and refugees can only worsen the whole situation. And also there's a worrying lack of emphasis on other intersectional issues, for example, gender identity, sexual orientation, older age. So it seems very much on that sphere as well. We're not really seen as people. We're just sort of somehow one homogenous mass, which we're not. So those are sort of some things I'd really like to say on what work we're doing. And I know you've got one more question for me as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dorothy. That was, you just gave a very comprehensive view of all that you've been doing through your group and through your advocacy, but also kind of informing what is the situation or the current situation in the UK. So thank you for that. And yes, moving on to the last question is, if you could please tell us, how do you plan to use the UN guidelines on deinstitutionalization in your advocacy?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question as well. I mean, in many ways, we've been doing that already, because what we found when the very helpful guidelines came out was that they very usefully, very well captured a lot of what we're doing already. So the challenges that I've just been outlining in many ways also pick up some key aspects of the guidelines. But what I've also been doing and will continue doing is I've circulated the guidelines among Liberation members because I want to be really sure they're aware of them. And in turn, we'll build on that to circulate them more widely so they're better known among, the government itself, people who provide services, sort of the general public. Another thing we've actually already done is include a call to the UK government to use the guidelines. And we've done that in our submission to the government about the draft mental health bill. So in other words, we're calling on the government to make sure that mental health reform does respect deinstitutionalisation to the full in line with those guidelines. One other thing I've just had the opportunity to do, and this will come out in the spring, is to write an article for the British Association of Social Workers, and that will come out in their journal in the spring. And again, it's a challenge to the British Association of Social Workers to make full use of deinstitutionalisation approach, which in turn, of course, will mean quite a fundamental change in their guidelines. Because again, it would be true to say that most social workers in this country, again, are currently supporting an essentially institutional approach because they're essentially supporting the Mental Health Act. And to add one other point about what we'll be doing, we will be using the guidelines to continue challenging the UK government about its very inadequate reform of mental health law, the crucial need for reform to bring a complete end to all forms of institutionalisation. It's really important we have our full human rights, and we're not going to give up until we've got them.
Thank you, Dorothy. That's so inspiring to even listen to all these steps that you've already taken and that you're planning to do. And thank you for such clear responses. We would like to thank you again for giving us the time to do these interviews and telling us about your work, and all the very best for all these tasks ahead that you've outlined. Thank you.
Thank you. It's really good to have the link with TCI.
Thank you.